Our session this afternoon basically is a closing session, but it will be useful to get a feel of what has transpired from other parallel sessions that we have had, because not everyone was able to attend every session. So for those parallel sessions, we would have the privilege to have chairpersons to give us a snapshot in 5 minutes of what were the key reflections and recommendations. Key reflections and recommendations that came out of the discussions in the sessions they chaired. So we'll start with Maria on my left. 5 minutes to give you a reflection. Maria chaired a session that was titled Institutions, Regional Integration, and States, and industrialization being an integral part of the discussion. Karibu.
Thank you very much. As rightfully so, the title was Institutions, Regional Integration and States. And one of the overall view was that when we discussed so-called institutions, I think that was the main takeaway. We're also looking at an industrial aspect as well. So we had 3 presentations, and out of that, 2 of the presentations were looking at mining, and I will go into a bit more details in that aspect. And the last presentation, or the third one by Professor Lars, was looking more at industrialization as it is, and to talk about the institutions and the institutional structures that are needed for that. And our discussant for this particular group was Professor Baregu. For the first presentation, which was from Laura Lynn Kaziboni, it was looking at what she very simply used an acronym of NSI, which is National Systems and Innovation. And this was a study that she did together with a colleague that was mainly looking about linkages, about innovation, and what are the key important things that are needed in terms of mining. So the countries that they looked at, apart from South Africa, was Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. And some of the key takeaways from these studies has been around the necessity for education and training that is key in this case, especially because of the innovation aspect. They also looked in this particular aspect, the labor mobility, which is another factor, the fact that people can move from one country to another. In terms of the training and the skills, they also saw some declining engineering skills in the region. They talked about how Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe has suffered because of the fact that they're now getting some of the skills from South Africa. There was a longer discussion about the whole aspect of innovation, which I found that later on was one of the key takeaways for most of us, which was about the fact that how much of the budgets or the expenditures are being used on innovation. In Africa, it's very low. It seems from their study that South Africa is basically the only African country that's really putting some emphasis in that. And overall, there has been a domination of the industry by South Africa in the region. And last but not least, there was talk about local content policy, which in this particular case, it's very relevant for Tanzania as well. And what the study found was that there's a lack of enforcement. So they're very nice policies on paper, but when it comes to actual enforcement of that policy, it is not taking part. Moving on from there, we had a fascinating presentation by Professor Deborah Bryson, and she has been somebody who has been looking at artisanal mining in Tanzania, or we're used to saying small-scale mining. And her presentation was something that contrasted it with the large industrial mining that is happening, which is usually the focus of discussion whenever there is a more public discussion around mining. And what was very interesting was that her study, which came out a bit later, was at a certain period of time until 2013, But she, to summarize in a nutshell, she was talking about what she called the kind of gold rush that, that has happened in Tanzania quietly without really the larger part of the society seeing that all these small-scale or artisanal miners have been flocking into areas that have a lot of vast of wealth. It started back, and she took us back from the history of this country, how it started, but then it peaked later in the early 2000s, and later on, because of the price of gold, skyrocketed all the way up, making it a very lucrative in a certain way, but very risky as well. And one of the things that came through in her presentation was about the fact that it still remains one of the most neglected sector within the mining. There are some experiments going on, and there's some attempts, sometimes maybe from even the larger mining groups, or in this case, sometimes from the part of the government, to try to see how they can be absorbed, but yet they still remain very much on the edge. They do not have access to finance, and they also, which is very, very important, provide a larger labor absorption than the large-scale mining that everybody's looking at it as it's going to make a big difference in the country. So there was also some comparison and some notes on that as well. The third presentation from Professor Lars was called about running with two legs. It came from the quote from Mmari where he said, "We must run while others walk." And that, I think, was something that, in that presentation, was looking at industrialization and the fact that industrialization as it is what he has dubbed the leg, another leg of the structural change that needs to happen in Africa. Oftentimes, we have been in the past looking at agriculture. However, industrialization has been there, and his argument is that it's not, it is not necessarily, has not been an unsuccessful experiment or attempt in Tanzania. However, there has been outside factors that had led to the fact that Tanzania was not able to take off in the early and late 60s. The other point, very important point that we got from his presentation was the fact that industrialization is what we would call an old policy overtaken by time. And there was really the kind of discussion which I think we're all having probably around the world about the Brexit and Trump, Donald Trump's election. And one of the things that I think also Professor Bryson did together with Professor Lars is try to take it back to the fact that the industrial policy or the Western approach of having large industries has also been the source of rise of destabilizing political movements because of the fact that although there's talks about robotics, that was some part of his presentation as well, we're talking about people losing their jobs, and then the question then comes, where will the new jobs come from? It was very interesting in terms of the robotics that he was discussing. Professor Lars pointed out that in Africa, only 0.19% makes up in terms of sales. So when it comes to manufacturing and sales, most of the robots are bought in Asia, while Africa is really not even appearing anywhere near. So that meant that in Africa, still we're looking at an economy that's quite labor intense, but then we have to be looking forward, what will happen when that will eventually come in. So in terms of the robotics and the others, this first part of the presentation, for Professor Lars, it was mainly an issue about education policy. What do we and how do we educate our people? Where will the focus go? So this would mean a lot of kind of skilled training that would enable in the future for Tanzanians to be part of it. The second key point was the monetary policy, and he explained a lot more about the petrocurrency and many other aspects of having the right monetary policy in place if we're thinking in terms of industrialization. And another very important aspect, which is the third aspect, was about the industrial policy itself, and I found that very, very interesting, where the way he combined it together with the role of the public sector. And in the end, he's given us options of what kind of models to follow. It can be a model to follow that is, will remain very much focused on a free market economy, an entirely free market economy, or whether there's any role for the public sector in one way or another to take part in that. Very quickly, for Professor Baregu's discussion, he made several observations in terms of all the three presentations, and we also had additional comments from the audience that day. I know I've completely run out of time, so I'm very sorry I had to summarize that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And next, Professor. Professor Mbelle chaired a session titled
Session 3.
This was session 3, Institutions and Industrial Policy. Professor Mbelle, you have 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think I'll manage within the 5 minutes, considering that I may not be presented with a bag as usual, the basket. So, if I had been promised a basket, I'd go 10 minutes more, but there's no basket, I'm sure. So we had 4 papers in our group. One was the role of financial institutions with the Tanzania Investment Bank as a case study, and it was presented by Mr. Shayo and Colson. The second one was premature deindustrialization in Mozambique, presented by Fania Langa. And then the third one was industrial policy and development of agro-processing value chains in South Africa, presented by Shingie Dube. And the last one on central local government relations and collection of property tax in Tanzania. Donald. Yeah, the methodologies used were, where do you press? The methodologies that were used included surveys, interviews, secondary data, case study, approach.
It must be something Dr. Likwelile has said, because he is the only one on his row, and he's on row number 3. May we kindly move forward? Ben, can you come forward, please? Thank you. Steve, can we come forward? Maria, Professor Mbelle, Dr. Likwelile, karibuni. Professor Mackintosh, Maureen. Karibu. Thank you very much. As we said since yesterday, we are live on Facebook. And so if there are issues or questions later on when the discussion is open to the floor, we will also take questions from online. This message is for our online viewers. Donald, over to you.
Thank you, Blandina. Good afternoon, everybody. This is usually the most difficult part of the workshop because it's after lunch. It's after people have had 2 really long days. I hope you will still be resilient to the end. We want to try to take about an hour, maximum 1 hour and a half to conclude this workshop. And thank you very much for being with us since yesterday. Our session this afternoon basically is a closing session, but it will be useful to get a feel of what has transpired from other parallel sessions that we have had, because not everyone was able to attend every session. So for those parallel sessions, we would have the privilege to have chairpersons to give us a snapshot in 5 minutes of what were the key reflections and recommendations. key reflections and recommendations that came out of the discussions in the sessions they chaired. So we'll start with Maria on my left. 5 minutes to give you a reflection. Maria chaired a session that was titled Institutions, Regional Integration, and States, and industrialization being an integral part of the discussion. Karibu.
Thank you very much. As rightfully so, the title was Institutions, Regional Integration and States. And one of the overall view was that when we discussed so-called institutions, I think that was the main takeaway, we're also looking at an industrial aspect as well. So we had 3 presentations, and out of that, 2 of the presentations were looking at mining, and I will go into a bit more details in that aspect. And the last presentation, or the third one by Professor Lars, was looking more at industrialization as it is, and to talk about the institutions and the institutional structures that are needed for that. And our discussant for this particular group was Professor Baregu. For the first presentation, which was from Laura Lynn Kaziboni, it was looking at what she very simply used an acronym of NSI, which is National Systems and Innovation. And this was a study that she did together with a colleague that was mainly looking about linkages, about innovation, and what are the key important things that are needed in terms of mining. So the countries that they looked at, apart from South Africa, was Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. And some of the key takeaways from these studies has been around the necessity for education and training that is key in this case, especially because of the innovation aspect. They also looked in this particular aspect, the labor mobility, which is another factor, the fact that people can move from one country to another. In terms of the training and the skills, they also saw some declining engineering skills in the region. They talked about how Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe has suffered because of the fact that they're now getting some of the skills from South Africa. There was a longer discussion about the whole aspect of innovation, which I found that later on was one of the key takeaways for most of us, which was about the fact that how much of the budgets or the expenditures are being used on innovation. In Africa, it's very low. It seems from their study that South Africa is basically the only African country that's really putting some emphasis in that. And overall, there has been a domination of the industry by South Africa in the region. And last but not least, there was talk about local content policy, which in this particular case, it's very relevant for Tanzania as well. And what the study found was that there's a lack of enforcement. So they're very nice policies on paper, but when it comes to the actual enforcement of that policy, it is not taking part. Moving on from there, we had a fascinating presentation by Professor Deborah Bryson, and she has been somebody who has been looking at artisanal mining in Tanzania, or we're used to saying small-scale mining. And her presentation was something that contrasted it with the large industrial mining that is happening, which is usually the focus of discussion whenever there is a more public discussion around mining. And what was very interesting was that her study, which came out a bit later, was at a certain period of time until 2013. But she, to summarize in a nutshell, she was talking about what she called the kind of gold rush that, that has happened in Tanzania quietly without really the larger part of the society seeing that all these small-scale or artisanal miners have been flocking into areas that have a lot of vast of wealth. It started back, and she took us back from the history of this country, how it started, but then it peaked later in the early 2000s, and later on, because of the price of gold, skyrocketed all the way up, making it a very lucrative in a certain way, but very risky as well. And one of the things that came through in her presentation was about the fact that it still remains one of the most neglected sector within the mining. There are some experiments going on, and there's some attempts, sometimes maybe from even the larger mining groups, or in this case, sometimes from the part of the government, to try to see how they can be absorbed, but yet they still remain very much on the edge. They do not have access to finance, and they also, which is very, very important, provide a larger labor absorption than the large-scale mining that everybody's looking at it as it's going to make a big difference in the country. So there was also some comparison and some notes on that as well. The third presentation from Professor Lars was called about running with two legs. It came from the quote from Mmari where he said, "We must run while others walk." And that, I think, was something that, in that presentation, was looking at industrialization and the fact that industrialization as it is what he has dubbed the leg, another leg of the structural change that needs to happen in Africa. Oftentimes, we have been in the past looking at agriculture. However, industrialization has been there, and his argument is that it is not necessarily, has not been an unsuccessful experiment or attempt in Tanzania. However, there has been outside factors that had led to the fact that Tanzania was not able to take off in the early and late 60s. The other point, very important point that we got from his presentation was the fact that industrialization is what we would call an old policy overtaken by time. And there was really the kind of discussion which I think we're all having probably around the world about the Brexit and Donald Trump's election. And one of the things that I think also Professor Bryson did, together with Professor Lars, is try to take it back to the fact that the industrial policy or the Western approach of having large industries has also been the source of rise of destabilizing political movements because of the fact that although there's talks about robotics, that was some part of his presentation as well, we're talking about people losing their jobs, and then the question then comes, where will the new jobs come from? It was very interesting in terms of the robotics that he was discussing. Professor Lars pointed out that in Africa, only 0.19% makes up in terms of sales. So when it comes to manufacturing and sales, most of the robots are bought in Asia, while Africa is really not even appearing anywhere near. So that meant that in Africa, still we're looking at an economy that's quite labor intense, but then we have to be looking forward, what will happen when that will eventually come in. So in terms of the robotics and the others, this first part of the presentation, for Professor Lars, it was mainly an issue about education policy. What do we and how do we educate our people? Where will the focus go? So this would mean a lot of kind of skilled training that would enable in the future for Tanzanians to be part of it. The second key point was the monetary policy, and he explained a lot more about the petrocurrency and many other aspects of having the right monetary policy in place if we're thinking in terms of industrialization. And another very important aspect, which is a third aspect, was about the industrial policy itself, and I found that very, very interesting, where the way he combined it together with the role of the public sector. And in the end, he's given us options of what kind of models to follow. It can be a model to follow that is, will remain very much focused on a free market economy, an entirely free market economy, or whether there's any role for the public sector in one way or another to take part in that. Very quickly, for Professor Baregu's discussion, he made several observations in terms of all the three presentations. And we also had additional comments from the audience that day. I know I've completely run out of time, so I'm very sorry I had to summarize that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And next, Professor. Professor Mbelle chaired a session titled,
Session 3.
this was session 3, Institutions and Industrial Policy. Professor Mbelle, you have 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think I'll manage within the 5 minutes, considering that I may not be presented with a bag as usual, the basket. So, if I had been promised a basket, I'd go 10 minutes more, but there's no basket, I'm sure. So we had 4 papers in our group. One was the role of financial institutions with the Tanzania Investment Bank as a case study, and it was presented by Mr. Shayo and Colson. The second one was premature deindustrialization in Mozambique, presented by Fania Langa. And then the third one was industrial policy and development of agro-processing value chains in South Africa, presented by Shingie Dube. And the last one on central local government relations and collection of property tax in Tanzania. Donald. Yeah, the methodologies used were, where do you press? The methodologies that were used included surveys, interviews, secondary data, case study, approach, political economy approach, and the combination. And then we have the key reflections from the 4 papers. One is that industrialization is an important vehicle for welfare improvement of poverty reduction. Active role of government in industrialization is important, and we had success stories from Southeast Asian countries. The importance of coordination among sectors, government agencies, and different actors, and also that cooperation, exchange of information, proper coordination improves the quality of institutions. And there was also issue on the role of private sector. There was also need for a comprehensive approach in investigating how the market, economic structures, and agents interact and influence each other. The issue of stability and predictability of institutions is key, and also that political economic considerations do influence outcomes greatly. The paper on by Dube underscored the importance of regional institutions in addressing institutional failures of individual countries through regional value chains. And the RVCs and local industrialization were linked in that there should be a shift in national industrial policies to align and not to substitute, not to be substituted by regional institutions, and also that individual countries can leverage regional supply chain linkages to improve export positions. Now, we have certain illustrations of the interactions of the various issues. This is the case of Tanzania, where you have an interplay of national and external influences. If you watch the dotted line, which is climbing up and then going down, 96, that's where we had the highest contribution of industry in Tanzania's GDP. And then come 81, 85 there, when the structural adjustment program came in, and we really nosedived, though there is an argument that the industry was also declining, but the major shift here, the interplay of the external influence played a part in deindustrialization. In Mozambique, the outcomes reflected an interplay between dominant policy orientation, degree of attainable strategic coordination, and the power dynamics, as well as the characteristics of the domestic private sector. And this is where the author linked us to the deindustrialization, especially 2003, but again, the author underscored that it started in 1995. What you see, the peaks there are just 3 key industries coming in and sort of distorting the picture, but otherwise there was a complete consistency decline. And this is where she sees the emerging domestic private sector dynamics, linking weak productive capabilities, restrictive industrial policy which neglects learning and technological upgrading, the financial system which is discriminating against SMEs, limited and disarticulated markets, and this leads to the interactions within the economy structure, and this is what she calls the vicious circle of low capabilities reproduction. Here is an interesting story from Tanzania on property tax collection. This is underscoring the observation of instability and unpredictability of the institutions. Now, collection of property tax was decentralized up to 2008. Then it was centralized 2008. It was again re-decentralized 2014. Now re-centralized 2016. And what's the interesting thing is that wherever there is a shift, you see these marked shifts also. And when performance is looking quite good, as after the 2014, 2016, there is again back return to another system which completely distorts the predictability of the institutions and the policy regime. As we are talking now, TRA is collecting, and the collections are already, if you were to draw the lines for 2016-17, they're already down again. So this is an illustration of unpredictability in institutions. I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Likwelile, you chaired a session titled Institutions and Development. Doctor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We had four papers in our session. One was on institutions sustainable industrial development in Southern Africa, which was presented by Dr. Momo. And then we had a presentation of the survey that was carried out about institutions and development in Tanzania, which was made by Professor Francois. And then we had a presentation on Ghana's path to an industrial-led growth, a reflection of the role of decentralization, which was made by Dr. Amon. And the last one was on Uganda, institutions and industrial growth in Uganda, a review of progress. Probably just a few takeaways from all the papers. One is that we all agree that institutions matter for development, as they shape the rules of the game. And they also provide ground for effective engagement and policy formulation. And they also ensure predictability. So that's one of the issues that we really observed. Number two, we also said that institutions matter for the type and pattern of growth and also for the industrial focus that a country will be embarking on. But again, we are saying for that to happen, institutions have to be supportive, they should be functioning, well coordinated. We also need transformative leadership to take the lead, and also an environment that ensures good governance. Number three, we observe that success or failure to the evolvement of institutions, because institutions evolve over time. So there are factors that actually determine that. And one is certainly context, in which context these institutions are established and nurtured. Again, content, what goes into these institutions, and again, the kind of expectations that these institutions actually aspire to deliver. Number four, we said it's important to emphasize on decentralization if you are really wanting to have effective institutions. And here again, emphasis on local content and how we allow the local community to participate in the process. So that's very, very important, where we address the rights of the people, the issues of inclusiveness, and also how do you then ensure you tap into the local potentials. And then lastly, we said there are areas that stand out, and this came out from the survey that was carried out in Tanzania, where you can observe weaknesses of institutions. And these are the areas of land rights, the area of corruption, the areas of regulation, the area of state coordination and autonomy, and again, the ease of doing business. So essentially, these are the issues that we captured in our group. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Likwelile. Our last chair will be Professor Maureen Mackintosh, who chaired the session titled Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Professor.
Thanks, Donald. This was a really fascinating session. We had 4 papers, and if one takes them as a set, then I think what pretty much everybody was looking at was the interconnections between innovation, political institutions, and the set of issues around entrepreneurship and business behavior. And I think if there's an overall takeaway from this one, from the message really from pretty much all the speakers, it was that you can't really think about either innovation or institutions and how they work in order to develop growth unless you're serious about understanding business models and entrepreneurship. That business models on the one hand and innovation and politics on the other need to be related. And if they don't relate well, I think the message of several papers was you don't get the kind of growth you're looking for. So we had 4 papers. The first one, which was yesterday, was called quite provocatively Why Nations Succeed, Connecting Entrepreneurial Ecosystems and Industrialization to New Institutional Theory, which was presented by Professor Rolf Semer, and had been written with Dr. Leendert de Belle. And that introduced and described the idea of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, of a set of interrelationships that support entrepreneurial activity, and they were particularly interested in the interconnection between political institution change and the development of more effective business models and entrepreneurship. And in essence, what the paper argues, quite provocatively, is that there's really not much correlation between improved political, in fact they said no correlation, between improved political institutions and growth. What matters, they argued, is the relationship between political institutions and their impact on the business environment. So they're arguing, in essence, that entrepreneurial support, the support for the developing of entrepreneurial businesses, is key to the impact of improved political institutions. And they went on to argue that their research showed that that was best done at local and regional level. That there was a limit to what could be done through political institutions and their relationship at the national level, that the clustering and effective political intervention in entrepreneurship occurs best at local and regional level, and that's where the concentration should be. So they introduced the theme which became very much a theme of the whole set, I think. This morning, the two papers in the first session were first of all a paper on frugal innovation, which was by Dr. Elsie Onsongo. And secondly, although presented first, was a paper that was by Dr. Gladness Salema and Peter Noringa and was presented on their behalf here. And I'll do that one first because it was presented first. This was a paper in the health field on the relationship between entrepreneurial behavior and supply of drugs through the public system. So they'd looked at the public health systems, the MSD supply, the medical supplies department's supply of drugs here. And they'd been interested in 2 issues. They're looking at organizational theory, so institutional change, and they're looking on the one hand at what they called the buyer-supplier relationship. And in this case, what they meant by this was the relationship between health facilities and MSD, the supplier. So the ordering and supply relationship. And on the other hand, the institutional processes whereby drugs are supplied, drugs and supplies come either direct to facilities or through and managed by the district medical officers. And they saw that management at district level as centralization. And what they argued, again, provocatively, all of these papers have strong and provocative arguments, which made this discussion very interesting. They argued that really centralizing procurement, which is the centralization issue, at the DMO level was getting in the way of what they called the buyer-supplier relationship. And they argued that the business and organization literature shows that supply relationships work best if those buyer-supplier relationships are quite close and based on good relationships. So they are arguing for really further decentralization of those relationships in order to improve the institutional relationship between the medical supplies department and the local health facilities. That was quite interesting in relation to the third presentation by Dr. Elsie Onsongo, which was about the concept of frugal innovation. So here we're picking up ideas about entrepreneurship and institutions and looking at what Dr. Onsongo did was she described the concept of frugal innovation and the various theories of institutions, which I won't list, which I'm sure she'd be happy to distribute the paper, which come into this. But essentially, it's technological innovation and institutional innovation, which is suitable for very low-income people. And what she's arguing again is that she was looking at the relationship yet again between technology innovation and business models. And she's arguing that in terms of frugal innovation, to benefit those on very low incomes, it's important not just to look at the technology. In other words, not just for the technology to respond to context, but also to look at business models and entrepreneurial behavior which changes the context itself, so that people are more able to use the new technologies in question. And she gave us some very interesting examples of what she called frugal engineering, and the different changing business models that can transform the way in which the business context works in order to allow people to benefit. And I do recommend that paper very much. She had a very interesting phrase about good enough innovation, which I think it's worth. There's been a number of discussions I know here about the importance of industrialization that serves basic needs. Elsie's paper is very much along those lines. And finally, a paper by Dr. Nicholas Minot, I pronounce his name incorrectly every time, which was on a food security portal. Dr. Minot comes from IFPRI, and what he was doing was describing one of many, many innovations that one sees at the moment of innovation, information portals. This one managed by IFPRI, it's a hub, and which is attempting to provide good enough, rapid information on a country basis, as well as internationally, which will allow better food security policies. And in terms of the theme of the whole series, I think one of the interesting takeaways was that there was a lot of discussion then about how you might get those portals better used. In other words, it's all very nice and fine, and quality of the information is clearly going up, but really, how do you get people to use those for entrepreneurial purposes within their own societies? So in summary, I think it was a very innovative session, and it really focuses the importance of attention to business models and entrepreneurial behavior and the local institutions in terms of innovation. And I want to leave you with one comment. We had a really excellent discussant, Dr. Olomi, who was a discussant for all the papers. And he made a very interesting observation, which is that he asked people, what is the Kiswahili for innovation? And there wasn't a single answer. And so what he was suggesting is that really there needs to be some reflection about local concepts of innovation, including local language concepts of innovation. And I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I think that was an excellent summary. I think innovation, Swahili wouldn't be ubunifu. It is. There is a word for it, ubunifu.
That was creativity, not innovation.
Oh, others are saying that is creativity. Eh? I think this is the challenge to all Swahili gurus to go and coin the word. Some of the Swahili words have more meanings, two meanings. Could be invention, creativity, innovation, ubunifu. Please, a round of applause to the chairs. They've done a very great summary of all the work that has taken place in all these sessions. So I will now ask them to join the floor, and I will ask Professor Maia Green and Professor Lars Osberg to come forward. They will play two different roles. Maia will basically start by looking at the contribution that has been gathered from all this workshop for the last 2 days. And then after that, Lars would have picked from it some areas that will be proposed for further research. So we will start with Professor Maia. 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, I shall try. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, it's been a wonderful workshop, and thanks again to REPOA for inviting me, and thanks to all for the wonderful and provocative contributions. I'm not going to describe contributions in individual detail. What I'll try to do is give us a sense of what's been said sort of in totality as far as possible. And we've seen that lots of the same themes and issues and ideas have come back. We started the workshop with the question raised by the opening session of what institutional architecture can accelerate inclusive industrialization-led development. And many of the papers and presentations over the past couple of days have taken us through past lessons from Tanzania's development. We've been made aware of and reflected back on previous phases of economic and policy transformation and previous phases of Tanzania's situation within a global market and an international political economy. We've learned about the positive transformations in the economy of Tanzania, and we've also learned about the history of state-led industrialization when the state was our capitalist because there was no other, as we learned yesterday. And then we've learned about the failure and decline of that, and now the new economic context in which we have an increase of non-traditional and manufactured exports in Tanzania. But Tanzania is still quite a long way from the kind of product diversification that Lant Pritchard talked about in his presentation. According to the graph that he showed us the other day, it's somewhere near the bottom, along with some other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the key question really that emerges from thinking through those kinds of histories of economic and industrial transformation internationally is really, is it possible to fast-track the kind of change that would really be necessary to bring about the kind of deep structural transformation that industrial-led development, and I'll come to what industrial means in a bit, actually requires. We've heard during the workshop too about a number of government and private sector initiatives currently being taken to address various inefficiencies, improve regulatory frameworks to promote investment through infrastructure, availability of capital and skills upgrading. But core questions remain, and they've been raised by participants in the sessions and from the floor. And the questions remain in relation to the relative roles and contributions of the state and the market, how we make development inclusive, and how we bring about the participation, whatever participation means in this context, of all stakeholders. And again, some of the questions from the floor earlier on highlighted issues of inequality, inclusivity, and the question of distribution. And those are all raised by the issues that we've been hearing about in the workshop. We've learned quite a lot about the essential dimension of institutional stability. The need to have a predictable environment which enables investment, particularly investment by foreigners, and to foster the relationships which we've been told promote a particular kind of growth. And we've also learned that this can come from both rules and deals, and that the deals have rules so that you know how to be who, in Lant's kind of phraseology, but too many deals, we're told, undermine the rules. And we've learnt about the problems of access to deal making, and therefore the importance of having clarity, transparency, and fairness. And this is important because rules and policies aren't simple technical instruments. They're designed to achieve particular effects, or their unintended effects are tolerated when we don't intervene to change poor policies or lack of implementation. So policy is political, and policy making isn't a simple technical fact, even if it's not party political. I know someone got told off for confusing the technical and the political yesterday. But I think it's important that we put it explicitly out there on the table. What research is political, policy research is political, policy making is profoundly political, even if it's not necessarily, and perhaps it shouldn't be, party political. It nevertheless sets the frame for who gains what, and who gains less than other people, and who gains more than other people. And those are really important questions. So as well as effective institutions, as institutions, we were reminded yesterday that we have to think very carefully about we want effective institutions for what and for who. Who are the institutions effective for? What are they doing? And the institutions themselves, in scare quotes, obviously, become part of the political economy of inequality, economic growth, and rent-seeking, as in the deals world that Lant Pritchard talked about when he spoke about cronyism in Malaysia and those kinds of things. Deals matter in Tanzania, but many of the presentations spoke of the rules, which Tanzania has no shortage of. Is the gap, we have to ask ourselves, simply one of implementation, the fact-agent-action relation that Lant described to us, or is the reality that many of you from the floor suggested equally, if not more important, which is that the social, structural, and economic realignments that rapid, inclusive, and sustained industrialization requires are hugely complex and uncertain. And they're also highly risky for certain people. And that perhaps a lesson from both days' presentations as well is that institutions emerge from processes of economic change as much as they drive it. So there's a relationship there that perhaps we should consider more. Institutions are perhaps emergent, and we need to think about the properties of transformation which would promote the best kinds of emergent institutions. Another question the presentations raise is, again, some people have referred to this morning and in conversations, is what exactly is industrialization in this context or in any context? Do we mean productivity gains? Do we mean scale? Or do we mean value capture lower down the chain? And these different interpretations of industrialization probably require different institutional and investment frameworks in order to be productive, and being productive might not necessarily automatically be inclusive, that you need to create specific institutions which enable growth to be inclusive. We also perhaps need to be more realistic about how inclusivity happens or can be made to happen, because industrialization doesn't necessarily, as some of the papers from this morning, for example, on the small-scale mining show versus large-scale mining, industrialization doesn't automatically create that many jobs. From what people are saying, the problem of unemployment, youth unemployment in Tanzania is a huge problem in terms of demographics. Almost half the population is under 25, under 22, a huge number of people. How many jobs are going to be created in the Chinese garment factories in Tanzania in sub-Saharan Africa? Those are important questions. And for industrialization to bring inclusive benefits, that necessarily requires thinking about redistribution, tax systems, social protection, and how state and market are balanced, which are political choices, not a technical fix for the economy. So, as well as recognizing the different scales of economic activity in Tanzania, some of the institutions that we've been talking about, whether deals or rules, seemed perhaps a bit distant from the everyday experience of millions of Tanzanian citizens as they go about their economic business, as they try to kujenga maisha, and to build their own livelihoods by piecing different kinds of work together in what Deborah Bryson has called multiplex livelihoods. And we see multiplex livelihoods in both rural and urban areas, and I'm sure that the people who work in the formal industrial sector are also participating in other ongoing livelihood activities. These are the kinds of activities which drive the political economy of Tanzania through the services sector, through small-scale house construction, renting, and so on. And in looking at those parts of the economy, we also see the productivity of consumption, the two things going together at all levels. And that's an aspect of the economy and intensification that perhaps we haven't really considered sufficiently yet in this workshop, perhaps next year. I think what would be useful, perhaps Lars is going to take up some of this kind of suggestion as well, is it's worth perhaps trying to widen the frame of analysis to capture the bigger economic picture and to really try to understand empirically the complexities of the investment and entrepreneurship practices of actual people running different kinds of enterprises in Tanzania, in order to understand why people might opt for multiplexity, that is, diversification of lots of different kinds of small-scale businesses, rather than going for scale. And this brings me to the final point, which perhaps, again, we've not looked at sufficiently, is that a good deal of the uncertainty facing the investor and the entrepreneur at various scales here in Tanzania, and much of this uncertainty is external, not internal. It's a result of Tanzania's situation in the global economy. It's to do with global trends, competition, and the kind of financial system which determines how market values actually come into being, which is affected outside of Tanzania. So simply increasing productivity in Tanzania isn't necessarily a magic bullet. It depends on this wider context. Finally, back to the issue of jobs, which is what we're hoping industrialization and intensification will lead to, and the desire to increase jobs. We have to also think about the quality of jobs and the quality of the livelihoods those jobs generate. What P.S. Mkenda speaks of in terms of the steps the government of Tanzania is taking for economic development and industrialization can certainly enhance human development in rural areas if the benefits can be captured by the producers in the agricultural sector at the lower end of the chain. But one has to question whether a small number of low-paid industrial jobs at the bottom of the chain, replacing low-value jobs in places like China, are going necessarily to be as transformative as we'd like to think. This kind of growth, this kind of intensification, isn't going to be achieved necessarily through market protections. We talked about that this morning. But we do need to think about other kinds of protections, including the social protections that a rapidly transforming economy requires. And we do need to think about the politics of inclusion, equity, redistribution, and social protection. And we need to also think about the political utilization of the range of instruments that we use to get that balance right, including regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maia. Thank you very much. I think you've done a wonderful work of synthesizing at least the key contribution, and it gives a lead to some way forward in terms of both our work, but also in terms of issues for the consideration in the policy development. Now let's hear from Professor Lars on some areas that you think have emerged out of this workshop that will inform our research agenda going forward.
Thank you, Donald, very much. It is both a pleasure and a great honor to be speaking to you today. I can't help reflecting, I'll take a moment, that it was almost 49 years ago that a naive young economist from Canada got off the plane in Dar es Salaam. And it's sometimes easy to become a little discouraged. But as I look about this room, I think to myself, a meeting like this was inconceivable at that time. The progress that Tanzania has made in many dimensions of life, I don't know how you would have described it back in the 1960s in a way that people would see it today. So it is a great honor to be back. Now, in talking earlier on, Professor Pritchett introduced the useful analogy of Scrabble. And it was a way of reflecting the idea that the more letters you have in the game of Scrabble and the more valuable those letters are, the bigger the word that you can make with those letters. And you can make many different words out of a given number of letters. But I don't know how many people here have actually played Scrabble. But if you have played Scrabble, you'll remember that to win, you have to put your word somewhere on the board. You have to find a place that's open on the board that fits into a letter that's already there, where there's space enough for your word to be played. And otherwise, your word is useless. And I want to use that as a way of thinking about how the capabilities which one develops in a country depend, their value, their ability to be played depends on the context. And that context depends on what other people have previously played up to that point. And so here we are in 2017, and we're thinking about the problem of industrialization-led growth, and it's now a different problem than it was 49 years ago, and with a different history that has preconditioned the options that are open for industrial policy, which is, François Bourguignon said, is coming back into popularity in some respects. And if we think about the moves that other players in the game have already made, and the options that are available now, then the first thing I think we would like to know is how can we make industrialization? Well, first of all, you need some idea of a market. You need somebody to buy the stuff. And we can think of many niche markets in the global economy and in local demand for commodities. Whether we think of it as an activity or as a final product, still the first priority in research that can lead industrialization-led growth is to find what we want to produce, what we can produce in a productive way. And so that a key idea of what is available as an option in 2017 and going forward is kind of key. And if we're looking just at the microeconomics, the sort of individual level of firm or establishment process of growth, we need labor, we need capital for the individual firm. We need skilled labor, particularly labor that has the skills that the new manufacturing technologies that are emerging will require. We also need unskilled labor, but we need the skilled cadres of workers who will enable those operations to run. So one thing I think, another thing we need research on is not just market niches, but also the educational system and its capability of producing the vocational skill sets that industrialization will require in the future. We need access to capital and research that identifies just how, with a particular banking and financial structure that's available, just how emerging entrepreneurs get access to the capital that they need to thrive and survive. Because I'm a big believer not just in identifying market niches, but in helping the accidental flowers to bloom and thrive, because it's impossible to foresee all the possible things that can be successful businesses and where they can emerge from. We need more research also on the barriers that governments may sometimes create and the assistances that they can hopefully provide to enable firms and enterprises to thrive at the local level. So all those are kind of familiar microeconomic focuses for our research agenda, for markets, for vocational and educational training, for access to capital, for the improvement of public services. But I think also one of the things that is running through the discussion quite a bit is that we don't want to lose sight of the importance, the crucial importance of research on big picture items. Because all those individual firms will be operating within some macroeconomic context. And their ability to survive will depend in part, in many cases, on the exchange rate, on how cheap the exchange rate makes foreign competition or how expensive. And that depends very much on monetary policy. Now, Tanzania has adopted the sole objective of price stability. Canada was an earlier adopter of this strategy. I don't think it's been a great success in Canada. We've had 30 years of real wage stagnation, and I think there's an awful lot of questioning of that orthodoxy of central bank policy making right now in the immediate context of the financial crisis. It's a huge decision. And it influences everything else that goes on. So it needs, I would argue, a good program of research to evaluate its importance. The other big picture item I think that really deserves to be looked at is the whole trade model that Tanzania, like Canada, has adopted. I personally think that as we stand here in 2017, that we're at a time of great flux in global trading arrangements. In the aftermath of Brexit and the Donald, we have a whole new level of uncertainty as to what the international trading environment is going to be like over the next few years, and that creates both problems and potentially opportunities for every individual country. And you have to think carefully about where the real long-term interests are of a country. And I'm quite sure that the real long-term interests of countries depend on their particular historical circumstances at that point in time. I mean, we could say that we're just going to keep the faith and pretend that there isn't a problem out there, that the same agenda of focusing just on cutting tariffs, enjoying free trade areas, and opening up to foreign direct investment, maybe that will deliver the goods in the future. But maybe it's not also going to be too much available in the future. And maybe we ought to look at what alternative policy models and compare them to the returns that are available under the current policy model. So,
thank you very much, Lars. Thank you very much for pointing to the areas that we need to consider going forward. We have used the time very judiciously, so what I would like to propose before we close is to give an opportunity of about 10 minutes to the floor to see if there are areas that are important that may have been overlooked, or something that we'd like to emphasize that we consider in our research work, or something that we need to carry out along with us in terms of the emerging issues or contributions that we're going to use as we synthesize the workshop report to pick out the key recommendations that we'll make available to policymakers and other stakeholders. So 10 minutes, the floor. Dr. Mushi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I should commend the good work done by the two professors who have summarized what we've been talking since yesterday. And I'm glad, and this has to be mentioned, I'm glad Professor, the one who spoke last, has mentioned Tanzania has done a lot of good work, and that has to be recognized, acknowledged. That is on the side. But my contribution is the issue of, I'm referring to what our Professor Pritchard did say about organizational capability. And in this issue, I want to refer to what has been spoken here a lot about people are the institutions. Let's engage communities, let's engage the people to be part of the process of institutional building. And here I'm referring to the aspect of organization, building capability of organizations, and in particular, the local authorities, which represent the people. And also in that context, we may also talk about civil society organizations, which are always engaging with the people. So I would like to see this being really researched and see how we can bring up these local organizations, the local governments, the civil society organizations at the grassroots level, as a representative of the people, to be part of the process of institutional building and industrialization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moshi.
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. I think there's been a lot of talk about the sort of preconditions necessary to promote industrialization. There's talk about institutions, about infrastructure, regular supply of power. I think one element that hasn't really been talked about is market size. If you have a country of 20 million people, but most of them are spending, let's say, 50 to 70% of their budget on food, there just isn't a very big market for non-farm goods. And this connects to the issue of trade, because I think that initiatives like the East African Community create a larger market for manufacturers in Tanzania and the other member countries. And it's one way to get over this problem that there just isn't a very large demand for non-food products, for industrial goods. I think there's, one of the characteristics of manufacturing is that it requires economies of scale. So you can't produce cars, you can't produce a small amount of cars, or it's not economical to do so. And that applies to a number of other manufacturing goods. So I guess my overall point is you need scale, you need large purchasing power in order to promote the industrial sector, and a regional trade agreement such as the East African Community is one tool to expand the size of the market and potentially increase the level of industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We will pick others, but Lars wanted to say something quickly about the point you raised.
The point to raise is that demographic projections that I've seen project the population of Tanzania in 2025 to be 72 million, which would be bigger than France at that particular point in time. And so that is a potential market that can accommodate many commodities. So the question of trade and the issue of how important trade is to industrialization depends on not just the existence of the market, but the political sustainability of the arrangements which enable that market to exist. And in the aftermath of Brexit and Trump, we know, or we're starting to see, that there may be problems, even in rich countries, of the political sustainability of a trading area. So that's another area of research that I should have mentioned earlier, and that's why I wanted to grab this opportunity, that research into the distributional implications of industrialization and the stresses on political economy is a first order of priority.
Thank you, Lars. I've seen Professor Mascarenhas and Mzee Dandi, so those are the two remaining, I assume. Professor Mascarenhas, then Mzee Dandi. Yes,
Okay.
Dr. Ramesh, okay.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, I think I require my glasses.
But if you have a question that you can give a written. Yeah.
Is how little research work, which is domestic, generated by REPOA or other local research sources, was very little in this workshop. So unless I didn't go to the right sessions, but it really struck me, is REPOA departing from doing its own research and reporting its research, and inviting other researchers to present the researches? I thought I should settle this issue before we leave, whether REPOA is actually facilitating research and actually doing research and then reporting this research at these annual workshops, which used to be the case. And now I see a lot coming from Harvard, from Cambridge, from you name it, except from REPOA of the University of Dar es Salaam. So I said to myself, whatever happened to the local economists? And I was looking at Professor Mbelle at that time. So
I have a quick answer to that, Professor. I think REPOA is increasingly strengthened its capacity of doing research, and it is doing research. There are a lot of publications. If you could have walked around, we have displayed a lot of those. We also have them online. During the year, there are often many policy sessions in which we disseminate the results of our research work. But in a forum like this, we also give room to others. It's a forum for learning, sharing experiences. But I know there are at least 2 papers that have been presented here that were done by jointly with the researchers from REPOA. But we also want to give space and try to bring in, to cross-fertilize our own research knowledge with those from others, and especially those that have a lot more experience, who have done research in multiple countries, which we can then learn from those, and even inform our own future research agenda from that process. So I think I thought I should have said that. Closing remarks, the Secretariat is passing around to share the USB flash for every participant. This contains all the papers that have been presented at this workshop. We will also be posting them online, but make sure that before you leave, you have your own flash memory. I think now we will move to the closing session. We had a formal opening, but I don't think we really have to. We have an informal closing, I think. That's the best word, and I will try to do this. I've seen His Excellency Ambassador Roland is back here with us at this closing. Your Excellency, please come forward if you would like to say a few words. Thank you. Okay, I'm obliged to move to the dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I think I don't have words to express our gratitude and our appreciation to all of you for being here for these 2 days to participate at our workshop. I think you all agree that the relevance of this theme is both timely, but is also applicable to the rest of the sub-Saharan African countries. We have seen from the presentation that has been made from different countries that the general trend is the industrialization in Africa. And everyone is wondering what happened. So the emerging discourse on industrial policy as a potential solution to revitalizing industrialization in Africa has prompted us to rethink about the right institutional designs, and we have learned a lot from the presentation that has been made here, and how definitely we need to strengthen capability of our institutions to deliver the results that we all expect. We have heard about the interface between industrialization, the rural economy, and the local economic development, in which case the roles of local government authorities, civil society organizations, and the people who are also part of our institution landscape that we have been deliberating. I think I'm correct to say that this workshop has been very successful, measured by the diversity of the stakeholders that has participated, the diversity of thoughts, and the participation of renowned scholars from many parts of the world, the participation of distinguished past and present leaders of this country has been a very key feature of success at this workshop. We've heard from the experiences from different countries, the trends in the global trade and industrial dynamics, which are critical elements we need to consider in designing of appropriate institutions to drive our industrialization agenda going forward. There is definitely a new framework of thinking about institutional roles. Professor Pritchett brought this notion of deals vis-a-vis rules. I think we have had new ways of thinking about our own institutions. And then definitely there is need to challenge our assumptions that underlies the different industrialization strategies that we want to pursue going forward, whether we need to push for export-oriented industries, whether we need to look inside the country who consumes what and what we can produce, but we also need to reflect on our own comparative advantages and how that links to the capabilities of institutions to deliver the results. And of course, we all understand now the diversity of institutions, formal institutions, informal institutions, which includes people, culture, attitudes, hard institutions, organizations, the parliament, the state institutions, market institutions, but also soft institutions. All these need to align towards a common unit of purpose. And I think that's really a major thrust that have come out of this workshop. We will produce a synthesized report which will contain the set of policy recommendations which we will submit to the government, as the minister asked when he was opening our workshop. But we also will make this report available to all other development stakeholders. And now I would like to thank, I'll start by reverse order. Always the participants comes last, but I'll start with the participants. I would like to thank all participants that have participated at this workshop. You have been very resilient, staying with us long hours. Yesterday we ended here at around 7, and some of you joined us in the cocktail party. His Excellency Ambassador had other commitments, but he joined us later in the evening. And you have participated very actively. And I think these have also taught us very good lessons to continue engaging with all of you as very important stakeholders to what we do. I would also like to thank our panelists. They've done a great job. In all 3 panels had served different purposes. All the speakers, presenters in different sessions, the chairs, discussants, and rapporteurs. I recognize the honor that we had from our former leaders, including Honorable Joseph Warioba, former Prime Minister and the Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania. We have had the privilege for the 2 days to have a former Minister for Industries and many other portfolios, Honorable Mramba. We had the privilege to have with us some members of parliaments from the committees on industry and trade and investments. Today also Honorable Zito joined us, who was not here yesterday, but he had to attend the other committee meeting in Dodoma. We had the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investments, Professor Mkenda, the whole day yesterday. Today he had to attend other commitments. But the other government officials, members from the development partners community, academic institutions, sister research institutions, civil society organization, and all other stakeholders of development. We thank you very much. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this workshop, especially the delegation of the European Union. Your Excellency Ambassador, thank you very much for your support, and we do believe that you will continue to provide the needed support to make our work more visible and more relevant to policy-making processes. I'd like to thank the International Growth Center, whom we collaborated in organizing the panel this afternoon and contributed to some of the costs of this workshop. I would like to thank CRDB Bank PLC also for supporting some cost of this workshop, and the Managing Director himself, Dr. Charles Kmei, participated fully yesterday and was also on the panel that and made a very good presentation trying to see how the financial structure in Tanzania can be enhanced to support our industrialization agenda going forward. I would also like to thank Commercial Bank of Africa, who also contributed to some cost of this workshop. I would like to thank specifically our keynote speaker, Professor Lance Pritchett, who agreed to spare all his commitments. It takes really long time to get his commitment. We tried to look for him for the past 6 months. We are very pleased that you came, and you have given us a very different framework of thinking about institutions. And I do believe you will continue to work with us in days to come. I would also like to thank our organizing committee, which was chaired by Dr. Kinyondo. Also included Dr. Blanina Klama, who has done an excellent work as our Master of Ceremony. But there are also other members of REPOA staff, Khadija, Mmari, Godliver, Lulu, Enoch, Joseph, Joyce. I'm hoping I haven't forgotten anyone. All members of staff of REPOA and the board has given us a very significant cooperation and the teamwork that has enabled us to have this workshop here today. I would like to also thank NOCOM, our event coordinator, who has worked from a distance, but have managed to work with our team to get this workshop successful. I'm sure we might have made some mistakes here and there. We did not do these mistakes deliberately, so please forgive us, and those that we could correct now, and of course going forward, we will do so. Please, we will send our monkey survey. Please share your comments so that we can improve our workshops every time we do them. It's an annual event, and I think we'll begin to think about the next theme and some of the issues that have emerged out of this workshop. For those who will be traveling, I will wish you a very safe travel back home. Pass our regards. And if you are not in a hurry, please stay behind and enjoy the hospitality and the quite a number of tourist attractions that we have in Tanzania. And with those remarks, I think I should say we have come to an end of our workshop. Thank you very much. I will ask Dr. Klama if there's any announcement to make. Otherwise, I thank you very much.